All right, thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Matthew Bay. I am a senior analyst here at RANE, and I will let my colleague Nate introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Nate Fischler. I am an Asia Pacific analyst here at RANE as well. Matthew and I today will be talking about U.S. tech restrictions on China, a large, significant subject going on in the world today. So, Matthew, maybe you can start us off a little bit about maybe some updates, what's going on in this realm generally.
Yeah, so it's been a really, I guess, important, really a year now for what the United States has been doing on China. We've seen the U.S. be extremely aggressive and extremely effective at targeting specific sectors in China. The most notable of this was in October of last year when the United States put wide-ranging restrictions on the export of semiconductor manufacturing equipment that can be used to build chips that are below that have nodes that are below 14 nanometers. So basically anything you have in a smartphone, as well as then convincing the Netherlands and Japan to put into place similar restrictions to those two being important because some of the leading semiconductor equipment manufacturers are based in the Netherlands or Japan. And that has been effective in curbing China's access to advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment, which is a part of the U.S. efforts to ensure that China cannot, I guess, catch the West and catch not just the West, but also TSMC in Taiwan, as well as Samsung and South Korea, in terms of being and working producing chips at the leading node. Now, in recent weeks, there have been a number of revelations that have led to U.S. officials now looking at to the questions about chips that are being found now in Huawei's latest smartphone. The chip that is found there is supposedly it looks to be a 7 nanometer chip, which would be below the 14 nanometer threshold. And there are questions as to whether or not China has found a way to get around some of the U.S. export controls. But what's interesting to me is that a lot of this is actually stuff we kind of already knew that China was working on. We knew last year, even before the restrictions were announced, that China had been able to creatively use their deep ultraviolet lithography machines that they get from the Netherlands that are usually in the West used to produce semiconductors that are around like the 14 nanometer node level. They were creative in getting them to produce 7 nanometer chips, which is what we see now in those Huawei smartphones, which suggests that they're using those machines that they had access before previously to do that. Now, what the restrictions are targeting that the U.S. put in place are some of those machines, but the real big thing the U.S. is targeting with those restrictions are extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that are far more advanced, and they're the ones that are primarily used, and really only one company produces them, ASML. Those are the ones that are producing the more 5 nanometer or less chips that are, the leading node for smartphones and increasingly GPUs that are used for like training AI models. Now, what this doesn't tell us though is even that Huawei and SMIC, the company that was likely building these chips, were able to do 7 nanometer chips. It doesn't mean that they'll be able to use those same older machines to do more advanced chips beyond that. And if the restrictions are successful, that means the gap between what China can do with the older machines and what Western companies and TSMC and Samsung are doing with the newer machines is only going to grow moving forward. So China is going to have problems, keeping up with that. Now, that doesn't mean that China cannot achieve some of its strategic goals with these older chips. They have a lot of goals around, competing with the West with AI. You need the chips then to train these AI models. They will just have slower chips that does this. They need to take more time to train a model, or they need to have more chips to train a model. So it's more about the cost in many cases than it is not having the technology or the efficiency of some of the technologies that they have. So that gap will still widen, but it is at least notable that China is having, I guess, some success in being as innovative with the tools that they have, even though the U.S. is being effective when it comes to some of these export controls.
Sure, and maybe you could speak to that a little bit. Some of the recent reports that Huawei is successfully getting around some of these restrictions. I mean, you spoke to that a little bit, but what is there any credence to that? What is the key evidence points that suggest that Huawei can?
Right. It is. So it is the teardown of the processor, the Kirin processor that is in their latest Mate phones that draws back to it is suspected to be based on SMIC, one of the state-owned Chinese semiconductor manufacturing companies, the 7 nanometer process that they did, that there was evidence that they had last year, that was in a data server chip, I believe, that was then reported in like July of last year. So that is the main piece of evidence that people have, is just that teardown of the phone when it was released to market. And I quite frankly believe that it is legitimate. I don't think there's any questions as to whether or not this is legitimate. But even though the existence of the chip is legitimate, that doesn't mean that sanctions were violated. It doesn't mean that China was able to get around them, because if these are coming and produced from these older machines that either China has a stockpile of because they've been using for a while, they're just now getting more creative in the way they use them, or they are just below the threshold, the technical specification threshold that is eligible to be exported, then it's just going to be being creative with the things that they have. But I do think there is going to be a scaling kind of whack-a-mole strategy where the U.S. looks at ways that China is getting around some of these curves that are legitimate, not even illegal, and looking at ways to close those off. An example of that actually is for AI chips. So one of the other restrictions that the U.S. put into place last October, when they put into place the semiconductor manufacturing equipment exports, was on the export of server chips and AI chips that could be exported for China for use in like AI. That would have affected NVIDIA's GPUs that are commonly used to like train like ChatGPT, things like that. But what NVIDIA did after the restrictions were put into place is they basically disabled one of the nodes on the chip to have it go just below the threshold for transfer rates that would have triggered those export controls. So now what the U.S. is looking at and considering doing is now doing an expansion of the original export control to cover the newer chips, so cover the modifications that NVIDIA did. I think that's the thing that we'll likely see is kind of this, widening net of the U.S. The big question, though, that I have is, while they are designing these right now around these like technical specifications, do we ever see a shift more towards something that is more holistic, so that it's much more difficult for companies to actually do minor adjustments to existing chips? So instead of putting a specific threshold, they do something around end use or something like that. So I think there are some modifications that are coming on that, and obviously with the U.S. election coming next year, there's no reason to anticipate the U.S. slowing down some of these efforts.
Right, and to that point, I mean, another question that I have is do you see sort of an upper limit to what the U.S. is willing to impose on China? Is there a place they're not willing to go, a step too far, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The area that I will point to, at least for the semiconductor manufacturing sector or semiconductor sector, is causing significant disruptive harm to the global semiconductor supply chain. So one of the things that they have put into place and they've extended are carve-outs for companies that are for foreign companies, like a TSMC, like a Samsung, like an SK Hynix, another Korean chip maker, that have fabs in China that still need to import equipment because China can't produce it themselves to run those fabs. They have put exemptions in place for those operations, and those are by and large some of the larger operations in China that are making more of these advanced chips. So they've been trying to modify their controls so that the foreign companies there, which aren't as much of a risk because they fall under different U.S. export control laws, different things about selling to the Chinese government. There's a lot of other things around them that makes it okay for the U.S. to be accepting that they're producing in China, because it's not the Chinese government that ultimately owns those operations, or at least they can nationalize them, but they still would need they don't have the engineers training, et cetera, to run those plants. So that is an area certainly where the U.S. has shown a willingness to at least bend around it and not be too much. But an area maybe a few years now just to think about in terms of how we might see the U.S. also being a little bit more creative. While we are not in the semiconductor shortage the same way that we were 2 or 3 years ago, where there were lots of delays and things like that, that companies were waiting a year or more to get chips for some of their production, there is still a gigantic growing demand for what I like to call our like dumb chips, like the older chips that are used in things like washing machines or smart devices. These don't need to be as cutting edge as your iPhone chips. They're not doing a lot of processing. This is only kind of explode as IoT, and especially now as we see chips also being more readily used in things like electric vehicles. There is a huge demand for these older nodes, older technologies that a lot of leading foreign companies, so non-Western companies, aren't as interested in. They're not as profitable in some cases. They're not as not as, I guess, politically attractive. So like in the U.S. and in Europe, we're all investing in like the CHIPS Act, but those CHIPS Act funds are mainly going towards advanced chips because we want to be the best for America, right? So we want to make sure we're only doing cutting edge stuff because we think we have a value add there. But my point there is that as China, as India, as Indonesia, as more of the global middle class expands, and as well as more technologies just use chips in general, there is a huge demand growth that is still happening for those older chips. And if we then we look at new capacity that's coming online for those older chips, it's almost all in China. So there is a risk in the future that is if the U.S. keeps on expanding these export controls, which are mainly focused on the more advanced chips, and it's very clear from that, but there can have secondary impacts to China's ability to manufacture the older chips if we start to expand these too far. And then that's a question as to whether or not it creates problems the U.S. will have to modify and think about, do we need to put in place special carve-outs so that we're not affecting that as well? And that's another question. And it probably depends on who's in the White House, honestly, like how willing they are to work on that kind of an issue. I would imagine the Republicans wouldn't be as aggressive on, or wouldn't be as effective on trying to work around some of those changes.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thank you, Matthew. That was a very comprehensive overview of some of the U.S. Tech restrictions on China, and a lot to look for in the future to see where this goes. So appreciate it. Always read more at ranenetwork.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you later.